Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to talk about Sergio Perez and his recent stretch of rough form over these last 6 or 7 races in Europe. Now, of course, there's a lot of speculation online that Perez could be replaced at Red Bull after the next 2 races because of basically an escape clause in the contract, where if Perez is more than 100 points behind Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship, Red Bull would be allowed to break the contract, the new 2-year contract he signed for 2025-2026, as well as the remainder of his contract for 2024. And this kind of ties into a lot of the narratives going online about Perez really struggling on European track. So I decided to dig into this data, and we've gotten it up here on the whiteboard. So let's take a look. So on the board is data for what I would call the European races. This is not all the races in Europe. There's actually some races, so the Canadian Grand Prix would be included in this, and it's really all the stretch of races from the first race in Europe to the last race in Europe. And the reason I did this was because we know that usually in the first European race of the season on the continent, that is where the first upgrades come in. So that's where teams will bring their first upgrade package after assessing their data from the first couple races. And this has really been a talking point because one of the talking points that's out there is that Perez really struggles with driving the Red Bull as soon as that first upgrade package comes. So starting 2021, 14 races included in that year for this analysis. Over that stretch, Verstappen 221.5 points, Perez 110 points. In terms of percentages of Verstappen's points, 49.7. And if you compare it, and that was over that 14 race stretch. Now, if you compare that to his stretch over the whole season, percentage of Verstappen's points, it's actually a plus 1.6%. So he actually did better in Europe than he did for that season as a whole. 2023, 13 races for that year. 294 points for Verstappen, 170 for Perez. And of course, I'll also mention for this, sprint race data completely excluded. Actually, is it excluded? I'm trying to remember. It might not be excluded for this, but taking that aside, it should be roughly the same all throughout. 294 points for Verstappen, for Perez 170. In terms of percentage points over that stretch, 57.8, which is a negative 9.4 compared to the 2022 season as a whole. Then we move into 2023, and this is where some of the struggles actually became apparent, but the data actually doesn't really suggest that. 229 points for Verstappen, 107 for Perez, 46.7%, which is only a difference of negative 2.8. So it's actually a little bit worse, but not as bad as the difference in 2022. And then we get to 2024, where things have been very, very bad for Perez. To start, of course, a bit of a smaller sample size, only 6 races in Europe so far. For Verstappen, 111 points, for Perez, only 14. I'll remind viewers that Nico Hülkenberg in the Haas has more points over that stretch than Perez. And that, of course, comes out to a 12.6%, which is 33.7 percentage points less than over the first half of the 2024 season as a whole. So looking at those 4 years, 3 of the 4, Perez does do worse than Verstappen on those European tracks, or does worse on the European tracks compared to the season as a whole, 3 of those 4 years by quite varying amounts. Now, moving into average finishing position, this is one where you don't have as many outliers for the data, of course. The other thing for the 2021, for example, Verstappen crashed out in Silverstone, taken out in Hungary, and of course crashed out in Italy as well. So you have 3 races in Europe there where Verstappen had very, very low point scores. So that, of course, would have helped the numbers relatively for Perez there. I looked at DNFs as well, didn't find that there was really a massive trend, but that may have influenced that number there. Average finishing position for Verstappen, 2021 2.0, for Perez 7.3, so that's a negative 5.3 finishing position difference, which is negative 0.9 worse than the 2021 season as a whole. 2022, Verstappen 1.7, Perez 3.2, comes out as a negative 1.5, which is negative 0.1 worse than 2022 season as a whole. So for finishing position, almost identical difference between Verstappen, Perez, the European season versus the rest of the season as a whole. 2023, Verstappen 1.0, Perez 5.1, negative 4.1 finishing position difference, and compared to the whole season, 1.2 positions worse. 2024 so far, Verstappen 2.7, Perez 10.0, finishing position difference negative 7.3, which is negative 3.6 positions worse than the 2024 season as a whole. So for both metrics in the races at least, for 7 of the 8, Perez generally is doing a lot worse than Verstappen in those European rounds compared to the season as a whole. And of course, when you talk about why is he doing so much worse, there's a lot of reasons. Poor qualifying is definitely one of them. So for quali, these are Verstappen's, they're negatives, not positives, so this is from Verstappen's perspective. Median qualifying gap in Europe versus all, and then the difference between them. So 2021, negative 0.494 for all the whole season, 0.455, so a difference of 3.9 hundredths of a second, very, very little, if anything there. 2022, negative 7.35 in Europe, negative 0.35 for all of them. So difference of 0.35, so 0.3 of a second, quite a big gap in 2022. 2023, 0.726 over the whole season, 0.527, so that's just shy of 0.2 of a second slower in qualifying compared to Verstappen than in the whole season. And then 2024, 0.773 in Europe, and then 0.359 over the course of the whole season, which is the difference of 0.414. Very interesting that for 2022, 2023, 2024, median qualifying gap to Verstappen, very, very similar, just a hair above 0.7 of a second. And of course, and then when you look at the differences, they do vary, but all of them in the negative. Perez is doing worse in qualifying in these European rounds compared to how he does overall. So we have a pretty good amount of data here that suggests that Perez is just doing a lot worse in Europe than he is in the races before Europe and after Europe. And of course, for this season, the data is a bit skewed because we haven't had the races after Europe, but still it's about 50-50 non-European races, 50-50 European races. And now I want to talk about this data down here, which is data that I use to kind of analyze how fast cars are in different seasons, both qualifying and in race trim. One of the reasons why Perez is under so much more pressure this year compared to this time last year is that we have a fight. We could have a fight for that Constructors' Championship. You have McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, who all, if things go right for them in the second half of the season and things kind of continue the way they are for Red Bull, could pose a real championship threat, at least in the Constructors' Championship. And I think that's why Red Bull are so worried and why the pressure is so much higher this year. So let's take a look at the data. So this is for qualifying, this is for the race. So for teams within 0.5 seconds of Red Bull in qualifying, 2021 you only had 2 teams, and this is of course on average, Mercedes and Ferrari. Of course, big title fight with Mercedes that year. Ferrari, some good races in qualifying, but generally the race pace was quite poor that year. 2022, Ferrari was the only team within half a second on average of qualifying of the Red Bull. 2023, you had both Mercedes and Ferrari with half a second. 2024, you have McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes all within half a second on average in qualifying. So you have 3 teams, which is the first time in this 4-year set that you have 3 teams that close. So in qualifying, definitely more competition at the front of the grid, which of course makes it harder for Perez to qualify further up, even given his general deficiencies compared to Verstappen in that metric. Now, this is cars within 2 minimum average finishing positions. So minimum average finishing position is basically, you go at every race, you take the highest ranking driver's finishing position for every single round, and then you average them out over the course of the season. I find it's a really interesting metric and a really good metric to try to kind of judge how fast a car is over the course of the season. So in blue here I have Red Bull, black are the teams that are within 2 finishing positions on this metric, and then red are the teams that are not within 2. And I've only done the top 4 in the constructors because that's really, or not the top 4 in the constructors, best 4 cars in this metric over this time period. So 2021 Mercedes best on this metric 2.36, slightly better than the Red Bull 2.55. And then third you had Ferrari 4.91 and McLaren 5.73, both outside of that 2 position window that we're looking at. 2022 Red Bull, of course, best car over the course of the season 1.38, Ferrari 2.71, the only car that season within that within the range for the race pace. For Mercedes, 3.51, and then Alpine was next with 6.95. So you can see massive gap there between the Mercedes and the Alpine, but even then, still the Mercedes quite a way off of the Red Bull or the Ferrari. 2023, Red Bull again, best historic season, 1.18, which of course is best on the board. And then second was Mercedes 4.36, Ferrari 4.54, and Aston Martin 5.43, just pipping the McLarens there to that 4th spot. So you can see 2023 Perez still struggling a lot compared to Verstappen, but because Red Bull had such a massive gap in race pace, it didn't really matter that much. Perez was still able to get podiums, get consistent top 4, top 5 finishes. Now we get to 2024, Red Bull, definitely a more challenging start to the season compared to 2023 and even 2022. For this metric, 2.25, which is the worst year for this data point since 2021. Second, McLaren 2.83, Ferrari actually also tied 2.83, and then you have Mercedes 4.08, but of course they've been much better than that recently. So again, the first year in this data set we have 3 teams that are actually within these 2 positions of this minimum average finishing position statistic, really showing that this year a lot more competition at the front of the grid, which definitely is making Perez's job a lot harder, and is really why he's under so much more pressure compared to this time last year. Now, the last thing I want to finish up with is a little bit of data, really small sample size, so it's hard to make conclusive, really come to any conclusions with it, but that is that the upgrades, like what I mentioned at the beginning, that the upgrades themselves are what is causing Verstappen or Perez to struggle so much. You'll hear online, oh, the upgrade is making the car more oversteery, therefore it's harder for Perez to drive, therefore the gap is bigger. So there's a couple interesting data points. One data point that would suggest that is if you look at the qualifying gap, or just the gap in the race itself. Between Perez and Verstappen, 2023 Japanese Grand Prix, 2024 Japanese Grand Prix. Of course, this year, 2024 Japanese Grand Prix, the race was the 4th race of the season before those European upgrades came. Whereas last year, it was in its traditional fall time slot, so of course would have been well after the initial upgrade, even getting into the 2nd upgrade package of the year. For Perez, gap in qualifying to Verstappen this year, 0.066, actually is closest over the course of the full season. Last year, 0.773, so pretty poor there. Massive difference in terms of Perez's gap to Verstappen at the Japanese Grand Prix back-to-back years. Then we have the 2022 Miami Grand Prix, which was actually after the first European race, so it is included in this 2022 data. And then of course you also have the 2024 Miami Grand Prix, which was been before the first race in Europe. I believe it was round 6, I believe. So looking at that data, 2022, Perez's gap to Verstappen 0.045, but in 2024, before the upgrades, would have come 0.219. So yeah, a bit of a mixed messaging there. So I think with that kind of data, it's really hard to conclusively back up those kind of claims that, oh, it's the upgrades is why the Perez is struggling so much. So that's why I think it really comes down to why he's struggling in Europe. And if you look at European tracks, generally many drivers will say that they're much more technical. They're drivers' tracks, which means that they will widen the gaps, the natural gaps that teammates will have. So for example, if on a more kind of newer, more conventional layer, we'll say Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, let's say drivers teammate 1 and teammate 2, average qualifying gap is 0.2 seconds. On a European track, it might be 0.3, 0.35. So that's what's often meant by driver's tracks. More talented drivers will generally do much better at those tracks than they generally would. Other things that you could argue, European tracks, for example, Silverstone, Spain, a lot more front limited, something that Verstappen generally excels at. He's generally done very, very well at those kinds of tracks, whereas Perez famously is known for being better at rear limited tracks, tracks like Bahrain, for example. So, of course, higher percentage of front limited tracks, perhaps less rear limited tracks that he does very well with. Again, that's another possible explanation. So there you go. There's my analysis of Perez's struggles at the European races, and we'll see what happens over the next couple of weeks. Does he keep his seat? Does he lose his seat? I think I might do a video over the next week or two, kind of looking at who are the main candidates, because it does seem to be something that's being reported pretty widely, that there is real pressure on him and that there are real considerations for replacing him at Red Bull. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps out. And thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.